A police officer tried to humiliate a black CEO in custody. Seconds later, the officer realized he'd just destroyed his own career. He thought burning a man's mouth would silence him forever. He didn't realize the one he chained had endured worse and would make him taste his own fire. Subscribe if you believe cruelty never escapes consequence. The checkpoint door hissed shut behind Aaron Vance, sealing out the hum of the crowd and leaving only the electric buzz of a single dying bulb. The air inside the small inspection chamber felt heavier than it should have, thick with the faint scent of metal polish and cold oil. Aaron stood still, his briefcase resting by his side, posture composed but alert. His instincts, honed by years of boardroom negotiations, stirred uneasily. Something about this special screening didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. "Sit," Officer Rain Calder ordered. His voice carried neither politeness nor explanation, just control. Aaron obeyed, lowering himself into the hard-backed metal chair in the center of the room. The seat was bolted to the floor, its steel legs faintly vibrating with the rhythm of the station beyond. Rain's boots echoed as he circled once, clipboard in hand, eyes studying Aaron as though dissecting a problem rather than conducting an inspection. Aaron met his gaze evenly. "You said this was a security screening. What exactly are you looking for?" "Routine procedure," Rain replied without looking up. His tone was too deliberate, like a man trying to sound calm while feeding on hostility. He adjusted the strap of his holster, the leather creaking in the silence. "You've been overseas. Big meeting, right? The renewable deal?" Aaron's brow furrowed slightly. "That's public information." Rain smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "I like to stay informed." He flipped through the clipboard's pages, though the papers were blank. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the steady hum of the bulb overhead. Aaron's thoughts sharpened. Years of navigating high-stakes negotiations had taught him that hostility rarely came from reason. It came from resentment. And this man radiated it. He watched Rain's reflection shimmer faintly in the glass pane of the observation wall. No, not glass, mirrored tint. Someone could be watching from behind it. But even if they were, no one moved. No voices, no intercom, just that single flickering light that seemed to pulse with tension. "You travel often, Mr. Vance?" Rain asked suddenly. "Often enough," Aaron replied. "Must be nice," the officer muttered, "flying in private jets, making speeches about equality, while the rest of us work 12-hour shifts just to keep your plane safe." His words carried the sharp edge of envy dressed as sarcasm. Aaron's voice remained calm. "If I've said anything that offends you, officer, I apologize. My work is about giving everyone access to energy, not taking from anyone." Rain's laugh was short and bitter. "That's easy to say when you're the one with the power." He tossed the clipboard onto the counter with a clatter, the sound bouncing off the steel walls. "You think you're changing the world. But to people like me, you're just another face on a screen telling us how we should live." Aaron leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. "If you believe that, then you've misunderstood my entire mission." Rain stopped pacing. The flickering light caught the glint of his badge, reflecting across the small room like a flash of warning. His eyes darkened with something deeper than anger, contempt. "Maybe. Or maybe I understand it better than you think." A low hum began in the ceiling, the sound of ventilation shifting gears. Aaron's gaze flicked upward. That wasn't standard for a screening room. He'd been through enough to know. "What are you doing?" he asked. Rain didn't answer. He turned toward the wall panel and tapped a code. A soft, mechanical click followed as the inner door sealed, locking from the outside. Aaron's heartbeat slowed, steady but strong. "This won't take long," Rain said, voice almost casual. Aaron's mind raced quietly. He could press, demand oversight, mention his connections, but doing so too soon could escalate this. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out his identification card again. "You have my clearance level," he said carefully. "My authorization has already been verified." Rain took the card, glanced at it, then dropped it on the counter with deliberate disrespect. "Verification's a funny thing, isn't it? It tells us who you are on paper, not what you really are." Aaron studied him now, not just his posture or tone, but the tremor beneath it. There was history behind this anger, disillusionment, bitterness, maybe failure, but none of that excused what was happening. He straightened his shoulders. "If you have a legitimate question, ask it. Otherwise, I'll need to contact Station Command." The officer stepped closer, close enough that Aaron could smell the faint trace of antiseptic on his gloves. "You're not going anywhere until I'm satisfied." The tension in the air turned suffocating. Aaron's mind cataloged every exit, every camera, every blind corner. He noticed something. One of the red indicator lights on the ceiling camera was off. Disabled. A precaution, or a setup. His fingers tightened on the edge of the chair arm. "You've already exceeded procedure, officer." Rain leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried venom. "Procedures written by men like you." Aaron's pulse quickened, but his face remained composed. "If you think power gives you license to act outside the law, you're mistaken." Rain smiled again, tight, brittle. "We'll see who believes that when this is over." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, one fueled by principle, the other by resentment. Somewhere behind the mirrored glass, the faint outline of a second figure shifted, watching. Aaron's instincts screamed warning, but before he could speak, Rain turned sharply toward the side cabinet and pulled open a drawer. The metallic scrape echoed like the start of something irreversible. Aaron didn't see what was inside, only the way Rain's expression hardened, focused, almost relieved, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Outside, the faint noise of the crowd filtered back in through the vents, life continuing, unaware that something terrible was beginning to take shape within the walls of Ridgeport Station. Aaron's thoughts turned inward for a single, grounding moment, to his company, to his promise of reform, to the millions who looked to him as proof that progress could have integrity. He could feel that ideal being tested now, pressed against the edges of his own endurance. The officer shut the drawer quietly and turned back, expression unreadable. "You'll cooperate," Rain said simply. Aaron's reply came steady, even though his pulse thundered beneath the surface. "I already have." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness before stabilizing in a dim, amber glow. It felt like the whole station was holding its breath. Aaron finally understood. This wasn't a screening. It was an ambush wrapped in authority. And somewhere deep inside him, a spark of defiance lit beneath the fear. Every revolution begins when someone tries to silence the wrong man. Rain shut the door behind him with a soft click, the sound barely audible over the hum of the weak overhead light. Aaron Vance remained standing. The room was smaller than expected, windowless, sterile, and cold. A single metal chair sat in the middle, bolted to the floor, its shadow sharp under the flickering bulb above. Rain walked past him without a glance, pulled a clipboard from the wall, and motioned toward the seat with a nod. "Sit," he said, his voice clipped, polite in form only. His posture was too stiff, too still. Aaron noticed the tension coiled in his shoulders like a loaded spring. Aaron complied, settling into the chair cautiously. He straightened his back, careful to maintain a calm expression despite the growing unease scratching at the back of his mind. Rain began with questions that sounded official but felt pointed, weaponized in their simplicity. "Where were you born?" "Newford." "Is that where you were raised?" "Yes." "What's the name of the company listed on your ticket?" "Arklon Technologies." Aaron said steadily. It's mine. Rain paused. Yours, he repeated, the word curling in his mouth like a sour taste. And who paid for your flight? Aaron kept his tone neutral. The company did. Rain stared at him. Why are you smiling? Aaron hadn't realized his face had relaxed. He adjusted his posture, jaw tightening. I'm not. You are now, Rain said, stepping closer. You think success makes you untouchable? Aaron's instinct was to de-escalate. He offered his ID again, gently placing it on the table. I'm happy to answer anything relevant. Here's my clearance. Again, Rain slapped the ID off the table. It skidded across the floor. Aaron's heart rate quickened, but he didn't show it. His mind had already started to shift, no longer trying to leave quickly but to survive methodically. This wasn't an inspection anymore. It was something else. The door creaked again. A second officer entered, taller, broader, his uniform neat but his eyes weary. Officer Doran Pike. The way his gaze met Rain's, tight, practiced, almost rehearsed, confirmed Aaron's fear. This wasn't spontaneous. It was choreographed. Rain circled behind Aaron while Doran leaned against the opposite wall. High-profile ones, Doran said, his voice low and sardonic, always think the law bends for them. They forget who wears the badge, Rain added. Aaron turned slightly, just enough to meet their eyes. If you have a problem with me, say it outright. Rain grinned. You'll get it loud and clear. Aaron glanced up at the ceiling corner. The camera light blinked red, then stopped. A soft click. The lens powered down. Aaron's stomach sank. That was no malfunction. His voice was quiet but resolute. You just turned off the security feed. That's a serious violation. No one's watching, Rain said almost cheerfully. Just you, me, and a little humility. He turned to the side cabinet and unlocked it with a key from his belt. The metallic door creaked open. Inside were standard inspection tools, metal trays, rubber gloves, sealed plastic bags. But Rain didn't go for those. He reached for a large steel thermos. Its warning label read clearly, Caution, hot oil. A greasy smell escaped the moment the lid cracked open, a mixture of fried food, scorched metal, and something sharp enough to make Aaron's throat tighten. He stared at the thermos, then at Rain. What are you doing? Rain set the thermos on the tray table. You talk real pretty about systems and reform, but men like me? We get replaced by those systems. Doran said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the floor, but his silence was not hesitation. It was complicity. Aaron's breath caught in his throat. You're abusing your authority. This is assault. Rain stepped closer. You'll regret this abuse of authority, he mimicked mockingly, then leaned down, face inches from Aaron's. No one's coming, Mr. Vance. And in here, regret doesn't change anything. Aaron's expression didn't flinch. You think pain silences people, but it doesn't. It only amplifies the truth. Rain chuckled. Let's see how calm that voice stays after this. He poured a small amount of the oil into a shallow inspection cup. Steam rose instantly, curling upward like smoke from a furnace. The scent grew stronger, rancid, violent, deliberate. Doran finally looked up. His jaw twitched. Rain. But Rain raised a hand. Not now. Aaron's hands gripped the metal arms of the chair. Every part of him told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The camera was dead. The men before him were no longer guards. They were tormentors. And he was now something else too. Not just a CEO. Not just a reformer. He was a man with everything to lose who refused to kneel. As Rain stepped forward with the cup, Aaron inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on his reflection in the steel surface. This was not an inspection. This was a crucible. In that locked room, respect turned to cruelty, and cruelty to fire. The cuffs snapped shut with a sharp metallic clack, locking Aaron's wrists to the cold steel arms of the chair. The bite of the metal seared into his skin, tight enough to bruise. He pulled once, instinctively testing the restraint, but it didn't budge. The room, dimly lit by a dying overhead bulb, seemed to shrink as Doran stepped forward with slow, practiced precision. In his hands, he held a small dented metal cup, the kind used to test contraband for chemical residue. But this time, it held something far worse: hot oil. The scent reached Aaron before the heat did, thick, greasy, and metallic, like old fryer grease left too long on a burner. His breath caught. His voice, still calm but charged with tension, broke the silence. "You both know this is beyond protocol. If this room is being watched—" "It's not," Rain cut in, his eyes gleaming with something darker than anger. "Camera feed's dead. And no one's listening." Aaron turned his head toward the darkened lens overhead. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. This wasn't an interrogation. This was punishment. Doran remained silent, standing just behind Rain, the cup trembling slightly in his grip. It was the only sign of hesitation either man had shown. Rain noticed and sneered. "Hold it steady," he muttered. Then, turning to Aaron, he leaned in close, his voice a venom-laced whisper. "You speak of fairness, of reform, but men like you never bleed for it." Aaron's jaw tightened, but he held the officer's gaze. "Men like me built the systems that power this station," he said, his voice low. "You're not afraid of what I've done. You're afraid of what comes next." Rain's hand shot out, gripping Aaron's chin, forcing his head back. The pressure was bruising, his thumb digging into the hinge of Aaron's jaw. Aaron tried to turn away, but the cuffs held him fast. "Open your mouth," Rain hissed. Aaron clenched his teeth. Wrong move. Rain slapped him, hard, then gripped his jaw again, this time using the knuckles of his free hand to force it open. Aaron growled through the pain, struggling to keep control, but Doran stepped in, lifting the metal cup. The surface of the oil shimmered, golden and angry, thin wisps of heat rising into the still air. Aaron's nostrils flared at the burn of the fumes. His mind raced, weighing every option, every angle. If he screamed now, no one would hear. If he begged, they'd push further. If he endured, he might survive. But then the oil came. The first splash hit his tongue, and everything else vanished. Agony detonated inside his mouth, a sharp, unbearable fire that scorched down his throat before he could spit or scream. The heat ripped through tissue, blistering instantly. His body jerked violently against the chair as he gagged, the muscles in his neck seizing. He coughed, choked, his vision blurring with tears as his lips peeled back involuntarily in a silent scream. The laughter that followed was not the cruel cackle of monsters. It was worse. It was nervous, hollow, cowardly. Rain and Doran looked at each other, neither fully prepared for the brutality of what they'd done. Should we stop?" Doran asked, his voice too quiet. "No," Rain snapped, covering his own fear with rage. "Finish it." Aaron could barely breathe. Every gulp of air scraped fire across his throat. The cup hovered again, but something shifted in him. Not surrender. Resolve. With a sudden, primal surge, Aaron slammed the back of his skull into Rain's face. The crack of bone on bone echoed. Rain howled, stumbling backward, blood gushing from his nose. Aaron didn't stop to see. He used the distraction to twist violently, yanking against the cuffs with every shred of strength. The steel tore at his wrists, but one arm shifted just enough to loosen. His fingers grazed the edge of the tray table just as Doran raised the cup again. In one desperate movement, Aaron jerked his shoulder and the table tilted. The boiling oil sloshed from the cup, spilling across the stainless surface, melting the plastic lining. A hiss followed, an ugly sound like acid on flesh, as the liquid scattered. Rain screamed again, this time not from a blow but from pain, as droplets of oil struck his cheek and neck. Doran dropped the cup, stepping back in horror, hands shaking. This wasn't the plan," he stammered. Aaron's throat burned. His lips were blistered. But through the pain, his voice emerged, hoarse, ragged, but sharp as a blade. "You made a choice," he rasped. The camera still blinked dead above them, but it no longer mattered. Something had shifted in the room, not just the balance of power, but the balance of consequence. Whatever illusion of control Rain and Doran had maintained was gone. Aaron's heart pounded. His body ached. But his eyes were alive. And the fire that had begun inside his mouth had moved to his spine, his limbs, his mind. This wasn't survival anymore. This was the start of reckoning. In that instant, pain became defiance, and defiance became fire. The cup connected with a sharp metallic crack. Rain Calder's head snapped to the side as the oil-stained metal vessel slammed against his temple, the blow jerking his entire body sideways. His boots scraped against the concrete floor as he staggered back, cursing, one hand flying to his face. Blood mixed with the thin sheen of oil already slick on his cheek. He snarled, rage and pain twisting across his features, but Aaron didn't stop to savor it. He struck again. The second swing shattered the cup mid-air, its rim catching Rain just below the eye. Boiling oil sprayed out in a molten arc, speckling the officer's face and neck. A guttural scream tore from Rain's throat as his skin bubbled and blistered instantly. He collapsed to one knee, clawing at his cheek with a sound that no longer resembled language, just pain and panic. Aaron, his breath ragged and chest heaving, didn't even notice the metal shards embedded in his hand. His wrist was cut from the swing, blood mingling with oil, but his focus was narrow and absolute. He didn't think about the agony in his throat or the cuffs digging into his flesh. His body moved with one purpose: survive. The door banged open behind him. Doran Pike rushed in, baton already raised, his expression caught between disbelief and urgency. "Down!" he barked. Aaron didn't obey. He spun low, shifting all his weight into the base of the metal chair still bolted to the floor. In a single, calculated move, he wrenched it sideways, catching Doran in the shin. The baton clattered to the floor as the officer shouted in pain, stumbling forward. Aaron used the moment to roll with the momentum, flipping the chair onto its side and dragging it like a shield. The clash of bodies and metal echoed violently in the tight room, ricocheting off the walls like thunder in a bottle. Rain writhed on the floor, blinded by pain, his screams growing hoarse. Doran recovered quickly, but Aaron was faster. He snatched up the fallen baton and drove it into the man's knee with desperate force. Doran yelped, dropping to the floor beside his partner. The surveillance camera above the room had long since gone dark, but Aaron wasn't fighting just for witnesses anymore. His suit was soaked with sweat, the crisp navy fabric clinging to his back and chest like a second skin. His throat was raw, the inside scorched from the oil, and every breath felt like inhaling fire through broken glass. But his eyes remained fixed, clear and burning with something no temperature could extinguish. Purpose. His hand fumbled against the floor until he found the fallen radio. It was dented but intact. He pressed the emergency override code with a trembling thumb, forcing his voice past shredded vocal cords. "Internal assault. Lockdown. Now." The system responded faster than human ears could. An immediate electronic buzz filled the air, followed by a series of thunks as the facility's automatic security sealed itself shut. Doors across the hallway slammed with precision. Sirens began to wail in the distance, joined by red lights strobing like blood pulses against concrete walls. Outside that small room, chaos was erupting. Inside, Aaron stood hunched but ready, his breath ragged, his burnt hand still clenched around the broken baton. The chair he'd used as a weapon lay tipped over beside him. Doran knelt nearby, one hand up in confused hesitation, the other pressed to his leg. Rain groaned in a crumpled mess near the wall, his blistered cheek oozing against the floor. "You," he wheezed, voice high with rage. "You'll never walk out of here alive." Aaron didn't answer immediately. He turned toward the exit, the flickering red emergency lights casting his silhouette across the cracked tiles. His voice, when it came, was shredded but steel-edged. "You tried to burn a man who builds power grids with his hands. You forgot I build systems, too." He crossed the room to the smashed camera mount and pulled a loose cable from the wall socket, live, sparking faintly. His fingers worked quickly, guided more by instinct than sight. A few strands reconnected into the wall port, redirecting the line to the internal power supply. The lens blinked back to life, grainy, distorted, but recording again. The feed didn't stop at the monitoring room this time. It spread, redirected into the internal security system's root directory, embedded into the backup server's live cache, accessible to any terminal in the station. One officer noticed it first, then another. The hallway chatter hushed. Within seconds, screens across Ridgeport displayed the live feed of Rain's assault, Aaron's scalded face, the spilled oil, the restraints, the brutality that had no excuse. A quiet panic spread among the corrupt. The story was no longer contained to that room. It had outgrown its cage. But far above the inspection floor, in the central control tower, one man didn't panic. Captain Lorne Vale leaned forward, watching the footage in full from his private console. He didn't flinch at the screams. He didn't scowl at the breach. His expression was flat, cold, deliberate. He turned to the junior technician beside him and said with perfect calm, "Delete the feed before it reaches the higher servers." The technician hesitated. "Sir?" Lorne's voice was frost. "If it does, this entire station burns." And back inside the locked inspection room, Aaron felt the floor vibrate slightly beneath his feet, the hum of systems shifting, codes rewriting, data funneling. He didn't yet know who watched or what decisions had been made above, but his instincts warned him. This was far from over. Yet in that moment, all he could do was stand among the wreckage, chest heaving, battered and burnt, ready for what came next. He had come to build systems of light. Now he fought in the shadows of his own creation. The corridor outside the interrogation room exploded in sound and color as the lockdown alarm roared to life. Metal shutters slammed down across doorways like falling guillotines. Red warning lights spun violently, casting jagged shadows that danced across the sterile walls like bloodied halos. The hum of machinery was drowned out by shouted security codes and panicked voices crackling through intercoms. Chaos had erupted, but inside the room, the chaos was older, hotter, and far more personal. Aaron Vance pressed his back against the wall, sweat dripping into the raw burns along his neck and jaw. His right hand trembled as it gripped the scorched sleeve of his suit, trying to contain the pain from where the hot oil had kissed his flesh. The sharp sting was constant, a reminder of just how close cruelty could sit beside silence. Rain Calder lay on the floor, half-curled, his uniform torn and face blistered from the boiling splash that had struck him minutes earlier. He let out a hoarse groan, trying to rise on one elbow, but his balance betrayed him. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Rage lived in his eyes, but humiliation made it cold. He looked up at Aaron and spat words like poison through broken teeth. "You'll never walk out of here alive." Aaron's breath was ragged, his throat torn from the assault, but his gaze was steady. He didn't flinch. "You tried to burn a man who builds power grids with his hands," he rasped, voice gritty and low. "You forgot. I build systems, too." The flickering bulb above them buzzed louder, like it could sense the tension thickening in the air. Aaron turned his head toward the wall-mounted security camera now dangling by a loose wire, broken when the feed was cut before the attack. The red light that once blinked, an artificial eye, was dead. But to Aaron, it was not beyond resurrection. His fingers moved with purpose, not grace. Pain lanced through his hand as he pried open the plastic casing of the camera mount, yanking a frayed cable free from the socket behind it. Sparks jumped. His fingers burned again, but he kept going, teeth clenched until he spliced a section of copper into the adjacent power port. The camera hummed faintly. Its light blinked once, then again, then steady. Grainy footage flickered to life on the station's internal monitor grid. Across the building, in various watchrooms and security offices, monitors came alive with a horrifying broadcast. Aaron handcuffed to the chair, oil being poured into a metal cup, and Rain gripping his chin. Then the burn, the convulsing, the screams. Officers watching the feed froze. Some went pale. Others leaned closer, jaws tightening as the realization settled over them like winter frost. This wasn't a glitch or a misfire. This was a leak, and someone had just blown a hole straight through the veil. Aaron didn't stop to admire the impact. He staggered back from the wall, his legs weak, the pain swelling in his throat and fingers like a tide that wouldn't retreat. He glanced toward Rain, who was now pushing himself to one knee, groaning, trying to reclaim the authority that had once dripped so effortlessly from his voice. But that voice was gone now, burned like his cheek. In the station's master surveillance hub, above the locked floors, a tall man stood silently watching the live footage. Captain Lorne Vale didn't flinch. The flickering images played across his face, but his eyes were unreadable, deep-set, calculating. "Sir," an officer beside him stammered, panic in his voice, "this feed wasn't part of the rotation. It's not from any current system port. It's bypassed normal channels. Someone inside—" Lorne raised a hand. The officer fell silent. Vale's jaw clenched slightly, but his tone was calm, almost surgical. "Delete the feed before it reaches the higher servers." "But Captain, if it's already—" "Delete it." Vale's voice was colder now, sharpened by certainty. He stepped closer to the console, his boots silent on the polished floor. The red light spun behind him, casting his reflection on the glass wall like a silhouette of consequence. "If it does," he said softly, "this entire station burns." The hiss began before Aaron could fully register the implications of the announcement. "Level 3, protocol active." His pulse surged. He had heard the phrase before, used when riots broke out or a suspect was deemed a biohazard risk. It didn't mean negotiation. It meant gas, silent, invisible, lethal in closed quarters. The overhead vents clicked open with a mechanical sigh, and a thin mist began to curl along the floor like smoke searching for lungs. Aaron's legs buckled, barely catching himself on the edge of a steel locker as he stumbled forward, throat raw, the memory of hot oil still burning through his tongue and palate. Each breath came with the sting of embers as if his lungs had been dusted with ash. His sleeve, still damp from sweat and oil, offered little comfort as he pressed it to his mouth. Behind him, Rain was crawling, dragging himself with one elbow, the skin of his cheek now a melted patchwork of pink and red. He coughed violently, more from the gas than the pain. "You don't walk out of here," he croaked, voice weak but venomous. Aaron didn't respond. His mind raced for solutions as the hiss grew louder. Then his eyes landed on the vent beneath the cabinet, low to the ground, smaller than his fist, but clearly the source of the toxin. He dropped to one knee, fighting the wave of nausea rising in his chest, and yanked open the storage panel beside it. Cables, tools, a roll of plastic tubing. That would have to do. He tore a 2-foot length from the coil, then jammed one end into the vent and bent the other to redirect the gas flow back into the wall cavity. It was crude, temporary, but it slowed the gas's spread. He could breathe again, just barely. "Move," he wheezed, his voice barely more than a broken whisper. "Get up." Rain didn't move, only muttered something unintelligible through clenched teeth. Aaron's patience snapped. He grabbed the officer by the collar, dragging his limp weight toward the wall-mounted control panel by the door. The keypad blinked red, locked from outside override. Manual code required. "You want to survive?" Aaron rasped, eyes narrowing. "Open it." Rain stared up at him through swollen lids, breathing shallow. Pain was etched across his face, but it wasn't enough to erase the contempt buried beneath it. For a moment, Aaron thought he might refuse, might rather die than help the man he tried to silence, but survival was a stronger instinct than hate. With trembling fingers, Rain reached up and tapped in the code. The lock gave a soft, metallic click, a sound like mercy wrapped in metal. Before Rain could speak, Aaron shoved him aside and braced himself against the frame as the door slid open. The corridor outside was dim, lit only by the pulsing red of the emergency strobes. An alarm's wail echoed faintly through the station, distorted by walls and distance, as if the building itself was crying out. Aaron stepped through, blinking against the brightness after the shadowed room. But just as his boot hit the floor outside, he stopped. Standing at the far end of the hallway, arms folded, was Captain Lorne Vale. Unflinching, clean. Not a single drop of soot or sweat on him. His uniform crisp, hair combed, sidearm held loosely but confidently in one hand. He looked like he had just arrived from a board meeting rather than a manhunt. Aaron's chest heaved. His voice came hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Lorne." The captain offered no greeting, no accusation, just a soft, measured voice that carried through the corridor like a judge's verdict. "You made my officers look like animals." Aaron didn't flinch. "They didn't need help. You exposed us. I defended myself. You undermined command. You enabled torture." The silence between them stretched, broken only by the distant hiss of gas fading behind Aaron and the low whir of the station's backup generator. "I can't let this reach the public," Lorne said, lifting the gun slightly, finger grazing the trigger guard. His tone was even, but behind the calm, something cracked. Disappointment? Or fear? Aaron stared at the barrel now trained at his chest. He didn't lift his hands, didn't plead. His next words were slow, cracked by fire and defiance, but steady. "And yet," he whispered, blood dripping from his lip, "it already has." The instant the floor rumbled beneath them, Lorne's finger tightened on the trigger. A deep, concussive blast shook the corridor. Somewhere behind the metal walls, a generator ignited in flame, blowing out panels and hurling sparks like shrapnel from an invisible war. The lights overhead sputtered, casting the hallway into blood-red flickers as emergency strobes failed to keep rhythm. A low groan rippled through the foundation, a sound that didn't belong in any building that still considered itself whole. Lorne flinched just slightly, but it was enough. Aaron surged forward. With the last strength in his battered frame, he slammed his shoulder into Lorne's chest, throwing both of them against the wall. The gun flew from the captain's hand, clattering out of reach as they crashed onto the tile floor. Aaron's ribs screamed in protest, his lungs desperate for clean air that didn't reek of smoke and burnt circuitry. Lorne reacted fast, faster than Aaron expected. The man was older, but the years had hardened him, not weakened him. "You think justice belongs to you?" Lorne spat, shoving Aaron off with a forearm across the neck, pressing him down. Aaron gritted his teeth, blinking sweat and ash from his eyes. Pain pulsed through every fiber of his body, from the raw burns in his throat to the fractured bones in his chest. He didn't speak. Not yet. He was watching. The weapon had slid just inches from Lorne's boot, but Aaron saw something else. Overhead, above the heat haze and the strobing red light, a sprinkler sensor blinked with a single green diode. His opening. As Lorne drew back for another blow, Aaron shifted. He twisted his elbow, driving it up and into the side of Lorne's temple. The captain reeled, stunned for a heartbeat. That was all he needed. Aaron rolled, dragging his weight toward the dropped sidearm. The metal felt cold and sure in his palm. His finger found the trigger, but he didn't point it at Lorne. Instead, he aimed high. One sharp shot cracked through the chaos, striking the sprinkler sensor squarely. Silence. Then, the hiss. A surge of water burst from the ceiling like judgment itself, cold and unrelenting. It flooded the corridor within seconds, slapping the tile, soaking uniforms, dragging ash and embers into the grates below. The fires, flickering behind blown-out panels, died with angry sizzles. The smoke thinned. The air cleared. Lorne sat against the wall, soaked and blinking, stunned into disbelief. "You could have killed me," he muttered, voice low, eyes tracking the gun in Aaron's grip. Aaron stood slowly, drenched, shaking, his breath ragged from the battle that wasn't over but had pivoted. He didn't aim at Lorne. He didn't need to. Power wasn't always in the trigger, it was in what came after. His voice was shredded, hoarse like broken glass scraping stone, but his words cut through the roar of sprinklers with more precision than the bullet ever had. "I don't kill," he said, locking eyes with the captain. "I correct." He turned without another word, water sloshing around his shoes as he walked toward the far end of the corridor. Ahead, through the thin gray mist, the glowing exit sign blinked like a heartbeat struggling to hold steady. Every step toward freedom now carried the weight of every man who never escaped such rooms. He handcuffed the CEO, pried his mouth open, and poured boiling oil down his throat, laughing as pain turned to screams. If you believe no badge can justify brutality, hit subscribe now, because justice never forgets its victims. Brax Heller stepped forward, boots striking the tile with practiced weight, the barrel of his sidearm subtly tilting toward the burned figure in front of him. The main hall of Ridgeport Station, once quiet beneath its humming fluorescence, now throbbed with silent tension. The rest of the suppression unit flanked him in a half-circle formation, black uniforms immaculate, faces unreadable behind mirrored visors. Aaron Vance stood alone, his throat wrapped in a scorched sleeve, jaw clenching against the lingering fire in his mouth. His chest rose and fell with every labored breath, the pain in his ribs sharp from where Lorne had kneed him minutes earlier. But his stance held, upright, unshaken. The monitors behind Brax still blinked erratically, frozen frames stuttering on screen, Rain holding Aaron's mouth open. The pour, the scream. "You crossed the line," Brax said, his voice like cold steel scraping concrete. His eyes didn't flinch as they scanned Aaron from head to toe, calculating, judging. Executive or not. Aaron raised his blistered hands slowly, wincing as the movement tugged at scabs along his wrist. He didn't beg, didn't plead. His voice, though hoarse and cracking, carried the same unflinching tone he once used at global summits. "I'm not the one who did." The words lingered. Behind Brax, several officers shifted. A few turned to glance at the monitors where the grainy footage kept replaying. Some had missed the live horror, but the visuals now offered no room for denial. A man handcuffed. Oil poured like punishment. Laughter, fire, screams. Brax noticed their hesitation. His jaw tightened. "Eyes forward," he barked, snapping one arm toward the line. "He's a threat." No one moved. Not yet. Aaron took a step forward. The sound of his shoes scraping the floor was louder than any alarm. "Look at what your badge became," he said quietly. His eyes locked onto each visor, challenging, searching for even a flicker of doubt. And he found it there, in the slight twitch of a jaw, the stutter of breath from one young recruit. Aaron kept going. "You didn't swear an oath to burn men alive." Another step. "You didn't put on that uniform to become shadows for corrupt men." Another. Brax's hand twitched at the holster. His voice cracked with sudden rage. "Stand down!" Now. But still, half the unit held their ground, not against Aaron, but against their own conscience. Then the silence shattered. Brax lunged. His baton arced high, slicing through the air like a guillotine. Aaron barely ducked in time, the wind from the swing brushing his temple. His knees buckled from the sudden movement, ribs screaming. Brax raised the weapon again, eyes wild, and then a shot rang out. Aaron flinched, his ears ringing. But it wasn't him who fell. Brax staggered mid-stride, the baton clattering from his grip. A bloom of red spread across his side as he collapsed onto one knee, stunned. The room froze. All eyes turned. Doran Pike stood at the far end of the hall, gun shaking in both hands. His face was pale, almost translucent, as if the color had been scrubbed from his soul. His voice came in a whisper, thick with shame and something deeper, grief. "No more," he said. "Not for him." Brax fell hard, the sharp crack of his baton hitting the floor echoing down the smoke-filled corridor like a warning bell. The scent of gunpowder and scorched wiring hung in the air as silence collapsed over the hall. Silence, except for the ringing in Aaron's ears and the ragged, disbelieving breaths that followed the gunshot. Doran Pike stood frozen, gun still trembling in his outstretched hand. His chest heaved, eyes wide, glistening with something that looked like guilt but felt like collapse. The other officers were stunned. Some stepped back, instinctively reaching for weapons, but none raised them. The moment was too raw, too unexpected. One of their own had just turned against the chain of command. The man they had labeled a suspect was still standing, bloodied, blistered, but unbroken. Aaron didn't hesitate. Every muscle ached. Every breath scraped his throat like gravel. But he moved forward, slow, steady, each step carved from resolve. Doran lowered the gun and dropped to his knees, the clatter of the metal louder than anything else in that fractured moment. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Doran said, voice cracking. His eyes darted up to Aaron, then away again, unable to meet the man's gaze. "Rain said it'd scare you, that's all." "Just scare you?" Aaron stopped, looming over the man who had watched as boiling oil was poured into his mouth, who had helped restrain him, who had stood silent when his voice was nearly taken forever. His throat flamed as he forced down the taste of pain, the memory of heat and helplessness. "And yet, you watched," Aaron said. His voice was quiet, raspy, torn, but it carried like a verdict. "You stood there while I burned." Doran's head drooped. He looked smaller now, not weak, but hollowed out, as if the man he'd been earlier had been ripped out of him, leaving a husk filled with regret. Aaron crouched, wincing as his knees bent, blisters straining under gauze and grit. He looked Doran in the eyes. "Then live with what fear made you." The sentence struck harder than any punch. Doran bowed his head as if absolution were impossible. Behind them, medics poured in, dragging Rain's unconscious form onto a stretcher. His face was half covered in a burn compress, eyes swollen shut, skin red and raw. Beside him, Brax moaned weakly as another officer secured his neck in a brace. Orders rang out. Security teams tried to re-establish control, but the chain of command had cracked. For the first time, Aaron could see the structure of silence and intimidation begin to crumble. Lorne, however, was gone. Aaron scanned the crowd, his heart pounding harder as he realized the captain's absence. No trace, no orders, no barking threats, just void where power had once stood. He didn't need to guess why. Lorne was the kind of man who understood tides, when to command them, and when to vanish before the water turned red. He didn't wait. Aaron stumbled toward the nearest terminal hub, past the scattered remnants of chaos, fallen batons, scorched floor panels, dropped radios, hissing static. He braced himself against a console and demanded system access. The junior officer hesitated. "I'm CEO of Arklon Technologies," Aaron snapped, holding up his ID with shaking fingers, "and I'm the man they tried to silence." "Give me access." The officer blinked, then nodded. Aaron sifted through the system logs. He needed proof, not only of what had happened, but why. Every command, every camera feed reroute, every emergency override left a trail. The evidence had to be here. He scrolled through the log entries with burning eyes. Footage archives, manual shutdowns, deletion requests, one after the other, each one stamped with the same digital signature. L. Vale, Captain Lorne Vale. Aaron froze. His chest rose slowly, breath catching in realization. Lorne hadn't just watched. He had orchestrated it all, every frame erased, every protocol breached, every backup suppressed. It was Lorne who had turned off the feeds, Lorne who authorized the special screening, Lorne who approved the use of confiscated property like the thermos of boiling oil. And it wasn't just one case. A few more entries surfaced, names, timestamps, similar incidents, all buried under layers of access restrictions. But Aaron knew what he was looking at now. This wasn't a random act of abuse. It was systemic. It was a quiet war on those who dared to challenge the old ways, men like Aaron, who brought light and change to industries riddled with shadows. An aide touched his arm. "Sir, medical is asking for you." Aaron turned, eyes dry but fierce. "They can wait." He copied the logs. Every file, every signature, every scar made digital. Outside the shattered interrogation hallway, more press and politicians would soon descend. There would be noise, fury, spin. But here, in these files, was the truth. He looked back one last time at the room where it all began, the same room that had tried to break him, and then he turned toward the emergency lift, toward the future he refused to let others silence. In the ashes of that night, Aaron no longer sought survival. He sought reformation through exposure. The footage hit the networks like a tidal wave, grainy, brutal, and impossible to look away from. Aaron Vance's face was everywhere. Burned lips trembling under gauze, eyelids heavy but defiant, handcuffed to a steel chair, mouth forced open by a man in uniform as boiling oil was poured past his teeth. It looped on every screen, day and night. With each frame, the myth of Ridgeport Station's order crumbled. News anchors gasped. Commentators stumbled over their words. "What you're watching," one host declared, "is not a foreign interrogation chamber, it's a public transportation facility in our own country." At Arklon Technologies headquarters, the boardroom was in crisis. Men in expensive suits and anxious faces crowded around a monitor, frozen by what they saw. One director finally broke the silence. "We need him to step down, temporarily. For optics. Recovery." But Aaron wouldn't even entertain the suggestion. He stood at the podium the next morning, throat wrapped in gauze, flanked by two aides. The microphone seemed to lean closer, hungry for his first public words. "This is not about one act of cruelty," Aaron began, voice hoarse but unwavering. The room fell into breathless silence. "It's about the systems that protect those who commit it." Camera flashes exploded like strobe lights, capturing a face marked by heat and defiance. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the podium. The gauze at his throat hid burns, but not the fire in his eyes. He didn't speak long. He didn't have to. Within hours, Internal Affairs launched an inquiry. Civil rights lawyers lined up. Senators demanded answers. The footage awakened something dormant in the public, a visceral revulsion that sparked protests in cities across the country. At Ridgeport Station, citizens lit candles outside the gates, and yet, within the shadows of rising justice, Captain Lorne Vale had already vanished. His office was found empty. His personal network wiped clean. Footage of him standing near the interrogation wing, arms crossed, face unreadable, surfaced, but by then he was gone. Not retired, not suspended. Gone. The deeper Aaron looked, the more chilling the truth became. He spent nights combing the system logs, eyes stinging with pain and sleeplessness. Beside each deletion, each override, one authorization code appeared again and again. LVX3197. Captain Lorne Vale. But it wasn't just Lorne. Doran Pike, now in custody, began to talk, slowly, nervously. His first confession came in whispers during a supervised debriefing. Aaron was permitted to observe through a one-way mirror. It wasn't random, Doran said, eyes fixed on his hands. Rain said Aaron was a symbol, said if we scared him, others like him would back down. The agent leaned forward. Who gave that order? Doran swallowed hard. Captain, and some outside names, private contractors. I don't know them all. The pieces clicked into place like snapping glass. Aaron's mind returned to his recent overseas trip. A billion-dollar deal for renewable energy. The public praise. The headlines calling him a visionary reformer. And now this attack. Not a mugging, not a scuffle. A message. He was being silenced. The contractors linked to Ridgeport had ties to security firms, ones that offered containment services for high-risk influencers in infrastructure and media. Their business model? Surveillance, intimidation, and disruption. And the most dangerous targets were the ones like Aaron, CEOs pushing transparency and reform in industries built on shadows. Every newspaper called him a survivor, but every headline missed the larger truth. This wasn't just an act of violence. It was a warning. He was no longer the victim of one man's hatred. He was the target of a system that thrived on unaccountable power. That night, standing at the window of his high-rise office, Aaron watched the city below. Distant traffic shimmered like rivers of light. He touched the gauze on his throat. It hurt, but not as much as silence. He turned to his aide and said softly, "We publish everything. The footage, the logs, every timestamp. If they want war through secrecy, then we answer with exposure." The aide hesitated. "Are you sure?" "They'll try to finish what they started." Aaron looked out again, voice like steel wrapped in fire. "Then they'll have to chase a man who's already burning." He didn't flinch when the first threats came. Encrypted emails, voicemails with no voice, surveillance drones circling a bit too close to his home. He documented them all, publicly. He understood now. The only protection against buried violence was brutal light, and so he gave them fire. Press interviews, leaked memos, internal audits from Ridgeport, evidence of financial ties between Lorne and off-book contractors. A coalition of reformers and tech firms joined him. A national task force was proposed, but none of it felt like victory. Not yet, because Lorne Vale was still gone, because there were more rooms like the one Aaron had sat in, and because behind each camera shut off was a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. As one reporter wrote the next morning, Aaron Vance is no longer the man they tried to break. He is the man who broke the silence. And deep down, Aaron knew the hardest truth of all. He no longer stood as a survivor of violence, but as the spark of exposure. The courtroom lights felt colder than the hospital corridors. Aaron Vance sat upright on the witness stand, his throat wrapped in gauze, his breath short and strained. The burn scars on his neck had turned from red to a pale, angry pink, but it was his voice, hoarse and raw, that carried the real weight. A bottle of water rested beside him, untouched. The prosecutor gave a nod. Aaron adjusted the microphone with trembling fingers and leaned forward. "It started when Officer Calder called for a special screening," he began. His voice cracked but didn't falter. "They led me into a locked room. I complied. I was calm. Then, they chained my wrists to the chair." Gasps echoed faintly. The courtroom was full. Reporters, activists, government aides, and law students sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks in laps, pens gripped tightly. At the defense table, Rain Calder sat shackled, his face partially hidden by shadows, the other half scarred with blistered ridges. He didn't blink as Aaron spoke. He only watched like a man staring into the face of the storm he had started. Aaron's hand trembled slightly as he continued. "They poured hot oil into a cup. Told me it was a test. When I asked questions, they mocked me. When I stayed calm, they grew angry. Then rain gripped my jaw, forced my mouth open. He paused to swallow, and the courtroom held its breath. And he poured it in. A collective shudder ran through the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward, lips pressed into a tight line. "I couldn't scream," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heat, it stripped my throat. I couldn't breathe. I gagged. I panicked. And when they laughed, something in me broke. I fought back. That's the only reason I'm alive." The prosecutor nodded, then walked over to the monitor beside the witness stand. "We'd like to submit the surveillance footage recovered from the internal feed, entered into evidence as Exhibit 7C. The screen flickered to life. There it was, grainy but unmistakable. Rain pinning Aaron's jaw, the silver cup glinting. The moment the oil was poured, Aaron's body thrashing. Doran Pike standing near the cabinet watching silently. The courtroom was silent. Then the footage continued, seconds longer. A tall shadow passed across the window outside the room. Motionless, watching. The frame paused. The prosecutor stepped forward. "This silhouette belongs to Captain Lorne Vale, does it not?" Aaron nodded slowly. "Yes." He stood there and did nothing. A chill spread through the chamber like a fog no one could wave away. On the opposite bench, Doran Pike sat hunched, his hands folded in his lap. When called to the stand, he walked as if gravity had grown heavier just for him. He avoided everyone's eyes except Aaron's. There was no hatred there, just sorrow. "I didn't know it would go that far," Doran said, voice cracking. Rain said it was just intimidation, that a scare would make him rethink his stance. "We were told to discourage reformist CEOs. Make them understand who really runs these checkpoints," the prosecutor pressed. "Told by whom?" Doran hesitated. "Captain Vale." He gave the orders. Said Mr. Vance was pushing too hard, that if we didn't push back, others would follow. Aaron's face remained still, but inside, his chest tightened. He wasn't a man looking for revenge. He had come for accountability, and now the cracks in the walls were finally visible to everyone. "Why did you go along with it?" the prosecutor asked. Doran swallowed. "Because he was my superior. Because I was afraid, and because I didn't believe someone like Aaron would fight back." From the bench, Rain scoffed, an ugly, guttural sound. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order." The prosecutor let silence return before addressing the room. Mr. Vance's injuries were not only physical, they were a product of a system that allowed this to happen. But what happened after deserves your attention just as much. He turned back to Aaron. "Can you tell the court about what you created following the incident?" Aaron's eyes dimmed for a moment as if returning to the night that changed everything. "I designed a protocol. It's called Sentinel Line. Tell us what it does." "It uses biometric data, heat signatures, pulse irregularities, motion tracking, to detect the signs of stress, coercion, and escalation inside government facilities. It doesn't wait for a complaint. It flags the moment abuse begins and alerts external oversight channels. The data is stored off-site, where it can't be altered." There were murmurs now, hopeful ones. But Aaron wasn't finished. It was inspired by that chair, by those cuffs, by that oil. If it had existed before, someone would have known. Someone would have stopped it. A young man in the back stood briefly. He was a junior data engineer from Arklon, visibly emotional before quietly sitting down again. The prosecutor nodded. "And has Sentinel Line been implemented?" Aaron exhaled. "We've completed beta testing." Investors were hesitant, but after the footage leaked, funding came in overnight. People don't want another Ridgeport. They want prevention. As the prosecutor moved to rest his case, the judge leaned forward. "We are initiating an immediate investigation into the whereabouts of Captain Lorne Vale. This court considers him a key figure in an emerging conspiracy." Aaron closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words settling over him like ash from a fire finally acknowledged. Rain turned away. Doran buried his face in his hands. The courtroom sat in stillness, like it knew history had just been recorded. Aaron stood, slowly, supported by a cane he hadn't needed earlier that year. His eyes swept the crowd, not with triumph, but with quiet purpose. He had not asked to be a symbol, but now he was. From pain, the narrator's words would later echo in the retelling of this moment. He engineered the blueprint of protection. The warehouse door groaned open on rusted hinges, splitting the early morning silence like a wound in the sky. Two plainclothes officers, pistols drawn, stepped into the dust-thick darkness of the storage facility. Their boots crunched over shattered electronics, discarded monitors, cracked surveillance domes, reels of obsolete cable. A third figure followed close behind, Special Agent Corwin Slate, Internal Affairs. His eyes narrowed as his flashlight beam swept the cluttered interior. "He's here," one officer muttered, pointing to the back of the room. A mound of hardware, outdated CCTV servers, wiring bundles, and scorched filing cabinets was piled like a barricade. Behind it, hunched in a folding chair lit only by the flicker of a failing lamp, sat Captain Lorne Vale. Unshaven, sunken-eyed. A black binder rested open on his lap, its pages filled with hand-drawn connection webs, dates, names, contract codes, and red circles over certain government logos. Lorne didn't flinch. "You took your time," he said hoarsely, voice dry as parchment. He slowly raised both hands, palms outward. "I'm not armed." Agent Slate motioned for the officers to stand down. "Get up," he ordered, keeping his voice level. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." Lorne chuckled faintly as he stood, the chair legs scraping against concrete. "It won't change anything," he muttered. "You can't reform what's built to harm." As they cuffed him, Slate glanced at the piles of drives scattered across the room, some labeled, most not. One caught his eye, a black casing with white letters scrawled across it, Ridgeport, Level 3 Override, Night Ops. Slate didn't need to guess. He turned to his team. "Bag everything." Aaron Vance sat rigidly upright in the courtroom gallery, a scarf wrapped loosely around his jaw to hide the burn dressing. His skin had healed, but the scar tissue remained, puckered along his throat like wax trails. He refused to let a representative appear on his behalf. This was personal. The courtroom buzzed as Lorne was escorted in, his hands shackled, his hair slicked back with a jailhouse sheen. He showed no fear, only a twisted calm, like a man who had already accepted he wouldn't leave a legacy, but would leave a message. Judge Morrell called for order. Aaron's heart beat slow but hard. Every camera was trained forward. Behind him sat investors, journalists, civil rights advocates, and a dozen interns from Arklon who had watched their leader nearly die for what he believed. The prosecutor rose, his voice cold and sharp. Captain Lorne Vale was not a rogue actor. He operated with intent, through structure and under a veil of institutional protection. What Mr. Vance endured was not random violence, it was policy disguised as discretion. The footage played again, grainy, haunting. Rain forcing Aaron's jaw open. Doran pouring oil into the cup. The flick of the flame. Aaron's scream. But this time, a second shadow appeared in the video, obscured by a one-way mirror, leaning against the frame. Watching. "Stop," the judge said. "Rewind and freeze." The image paused. Lorne's reflection was faint, but unmistakable. "You watched it happen," Judge Morrell said, "and you did nothing." Lorne didn't blink. "That's not true," he replied. "I authorized it." A gasp echoed through the room. Aaron felt no triumph, only clarity. It wasn't just Rain, or Doran. The real enemy had been the scaffolding of silence that let cruelty organize itself into policy. Later that evening, as news anchors dissected every moment of the hearing, Aaron sat quietly in the back of his office at Arklon. Medical gauze still wrapped one hand. A prototype interface for Sentinel Line blinked across his desk. The AI program's core architecture had already gone live in one district. 5 more were onboarding. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Julian Marr, Arklon's policy director, stepped inside holding a stack of envelopes. More awards. Donations. Invitations to panels, Julian said with a weary smile. Even the Secretary of Justice wants to meet. Aaron didn't turn from the window. Redirect it all. To where? Aaron spoke softly. We're founding something bigger than Sentinel. A network, real-time monitoring, citizen access, government pressure, whistleblower protection. Every institution needs eyes inside the walls. Julian nodded slowly. What should we call it? Aaron didn't hesitate. The Vance Integrity Network. By week's end, Rain was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary with no chance of parole. His face, still marked from the burns, was stoic during sentencing. He didn't speak. Doran was placed into witness protection, his cooperation saving him from a similar fate. His final words to Aaron had been whispered through trembling lips. I thought silence made me safe. It hadn't. And Lorne. His case became a matter of public record, a sprawling web of backdoor security contracts, coercion tactics, and falsified reports that reached as far as federal oversight committees. But in the end, justice didn't roar. It arrived quietly, without fanfare, without closure. Aaron stood before a sea of cameras only once more outside the courthouse. He didn't read from notes. He didn't speak long. When asked why he continued, why he didn't stop after surviving something so horrific, his voice was steady. Because silence spreads faster than fire, and it burns longer. The doors of Ridgeport Station hissed open with a mechanical sigh, revealing a corridor that no longer smelled of oil and scorched plastic, but of sterile polish and humming order. The overhead lights shone brighter now, not just in lumens, but in purpose. Cameras mounted in glass domes rotated smoothly, tracking every step. Beneath them, data displays flickered across tempered glass panels embedded into the walls, projecting real-time biometric readings, conduct alerts, and officer interaction metrics, all powered by the Sentinel Line protocol. Every hallway was a quiet witness now. Every corner, a testimony. Aaron Vance walked through that corridor with even steps. No security detail accompanied him. No press flanked his sides. Just the man and the memory of the night that changed the station forever. He wore a charcoal gray suit, his gait calm but weighted. His skin bore almost no trace of the damage done. A single pale mark just under the jawline hinted at the scalding he had endured. But it was his eyes that told the truth. They scanned the walls not with fear, but with precision, as if cross-referencing this renovated present with every dark corner of the past. Officers nodded as he passed. Subtle, respectful acknowledgments from men who once might have ignored him. One officer straightened his posture entirely, saluting stiffly. Aaron gave a simple nod in return. He did not smile. Not yet. The path curved toward the central hub where an open chamber buzzed with quiet efficiency. Large transparent screens rotated data in slow, hypnotic waves, facial recognition alerts, case review summaries, flagged behavior timelines. A badge scanner beeped softly, followed by a calm male voice over the intercom. Audit log cross-check complete. Status green. It was a far cry from the locked interrogation cell with the flickering bulb and boiling oil. Outside the glass-paneled hall, a small group of reporters waited behind the checkpoint barriers, cameras poised, microphones ready, watching Aaron's every movement through the transparent walls like he was an exhibit in the Museum of Justice. They expected a statement, something fiery or triumphant. They waited with their pre-written headlines. CEO returns to scene of assault. Aaron Vance tours reformed station, from victim to visionary. But Aaron ignored them. Instead, he stopped by a Newark trainee standing near the records terminal. The young man, barely older than 20, jolted upright the moment he saw him. Sir, the trainee stammered, offering a shaky salute. Aaron didn't return it at first. He simply observed him, the nervous stance, the clenched jaw, the eagerness to prove himself. Then he stepped closer, hands behind his back, his voice low and even. "Do you know why this place changed?" he asked, not accusatory but solemn, like a teacher asking a student to find his own way through the answer. The young man blinked, uncertain. "Sir, because of what happened," he said quietly. Aaron exhaled through his nose just once. Then, finally, a faint smile crossed his face, subtle and restrained, like light breaking through fog. "Because people finally saw what happens when authority forgets its duty," he replied. The trainee held his gaze, standing straighter than before, as if the weight of those words sunk into his uniform more deeply than any badge ever could. Aaron turned and walked away, past the displays, past the ghosts, past the station that once tried to extinguish him. That evening, he stood atop Arklon Technologies' rooftop, hands resting on the steel railing, watching the city hum beneath a sky bruised with sunset. Wind passed across his face like a whisper of memory. The lights below flickered not just with electricity, but with promise. The skyline no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt earned. And for the first time, the voice that had once been gagged by oil, muffled by injustice and burned from within, spoke again. Not loud, not angry, but unmistakably clear. The man they tried to silence became the echo that never fades. He scarred another man's flesh with fire and felt the same heat devour his own face moments later. If you believe every act of cruelty must be repaid, subscribe now, because justice burns brighter than hate ever could. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, corruption, and the devastating impact of power used without conscience. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, equality, and the urgent need for accountability in law enforcement.